SOA talk for the fall 2020 semester. Our speaker for today is Abigail Cottingham. She is a senior history major with a minor in public history and museum studies. And today she'll be presenting a presentation all aboard the Orphan trains.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with like a little kind of introductory explanation. The first time and the only time in a classroom setting that I've learned about the orphan trains was my 7th grade English class. And when it was presented to us, they told us that this was kind of an unknown part of history and that it was at the time in danger of becoming just forgotten. And we watched the movie, we read a couple of books, and we even did this project where we made our own diaries, acting like we were one of the orphan train riders. And they told us a little bit about what happened, but I think what we mostly learned was, again, that surface level stuff, and it took further of my own research to actually find out more about the orphan trains. So the orphan trains themselves have a little bit, you have to go a little bit back in history and start with New York in the 1800s. And New York was not a pleasant place to live at this time. And it was mostly overcrowded by waves of immigrants that were coming in and were staying here for work. And they were living in extremely overcrowded areas. They were living in really bad tenant housing, and that had no proper ventilation, no proper sewage, and so it was, and there was poor law enforcement in the areas, and so it was just generally a really bad place to be. And a lot of families were moving in here because they were the ones who were immigrating over. And so, yeah, it's you can see here that this is kind of one of the alleys that was near the tenant housing, and there's just trash all over the floor. You have entire families of like mother, father, children, and sometimes grandparents and uncles living all together in one room because they tried to get as many of these people into apartments as they could. And even though they were really poor living conditions, it was really expensive to live in these areas, mostly just because they were trying to get as much money out of the immigrants as they could. So in response to these poor living conditions, most of the people would spend their days outside, which just made the outside even worse. And so the work that these people were doing was very hard, laborious work in factories, and a lot of the times you may have heard the expression that they're very easily replaceable. And so a lot of people would be going to work and they would be working almost like all day, really bad conditions, and then in order to make more money, you had to send as many people as you could to work. So that included children. And a lot of times it would be the older men who would be working in like labor-intensive factories, but then children, they prioritized children for work where they could use their hands or they could fit into small spaces, which was incredibly dangerous. And there was no regulations for this. So basically children were being hurt and everyone, children were being hurt and there was, again, no regulations. So it was long hours, bad conditions, everything like that. And in addition, because these children were being hurt, a lot of times parents would lose their children, and so large families were important so that not only did you have more people who could go to work, but you could also have people who would survive to take care of you when you got older, which was the idea. However, more children was more expensive, and if you couldn't afford to take care of your children went out on the streets. And at one point, there was about 30,000 homeless children on the streets of New York. And when you have a child out on the streets of New York, they're not going to follow the laws. So you have children running around everywhere. You have children sleeping in steam grates like this. They're sleeping outside. They're kind of just getting in the way. And the police officers and law enforcement can't do anything to help it. So And yeah, it's growing, 30,000. So these children would be causing a lot of problems, and people started looking at this and they were like, okay, what can we do about these kids that are outside? And originally they were being taken to hospitals and prisons and things like that, but like the waves of immigrants coming in, filling up the houses, the children very quickly filled up these hospitals, and there was nowhere for them to go, and they ended up homeless again. So in response, this man, Reverend Charles Loring Brace, saw this problem and he said, okay, what can we do to not only get these children off of the streets, but also rehabilitate them to go back into society? Because that was the main problem, is that they could be given a place to live, but if they had nowhere else to go, they wouldn't really be able to go back. They'd have to stay in the hospitals and the prisons and things for the rest of their lives. So the first thing that he did was he took a group of newsboys and he's like, okay, we're going to put them into, we'll give them a place to sleep, we'll give them a place where they can learn and where they can get steady food and things like that. And even though he said that the newsboys didn't particularly like sleeping inside, they still saw an improvement from the fact that they gave them shelter and things like that. And so he's looking at this and he's saying, okay, maybe we can apply this to more children if this will fix our growing problem. So the orphan trains were able to be made possible by the Transcontinental Railroad. And the first group of children they send out are actually teenagers in 1853. And they send these teenagers to the east in the New England area to go work in textile mills and factories and places like that. And when they saw that this worked, they said, okay, so if we can do this, maybe we'll start looking where we can move our other children. But the problem is that these teenagers were coming from prisons and off the street and things like that, and the majority weren't teenagers. There was a lot of babies and young children. So they had to start looking to other places to move them. And this is where the Transcontinental Railroad comes back in, where it was moving to the west. And so they started looking that way to see if they could take all of these kids out of New York and move them west in order to move them into a less populated area. So after 1853, they started kind of gearing up to send a lot of these kids out west. And at this point, a lot of people started surrendering their kids to the Children's Aid Society because they figured, like, hey, if they can get a better life out west, maybe they'll have an opportunity. It'll be better than here. And so once they got even more of these kids, it made a bigger push to be able to start looking to get them out there because they were running out of room for them in New York. So the first orphan train actually ended up going to Minnesota, so less west than we see for the others. But the way that these children were advertised is that they'd be put into the newspaper, they'd have their picture taken, and they would do this Homes Wanted for Children thing. And as you can see in this picture here, all of the kids are smiling. Well, almost all of them. They're wearing really nice clothes, and you can actually see in this picture that a lot of them are light-skinned. And I believe this is on purpose. But as we see here, they have all been washed, they've all been clothed, and they actually did this for all of the orphans before they took them out, because they wanted to take them out of that image of being these immigrant orphans living on the street, and they wanted to make them adoptable, basically. And so we see a lot of these kids going from wearing rags and things like that, and like what you would think of as like the dirty immigrant sort of thing that was going on at the time. And instead you see these children, and they're smiling, and they're good children that can be adopted, basically. And as it says down here, it's mostly primarily babies and young children, and I think I mentioned that earlier. So the expectations versus reality are actually staggeringly different, because what you would expect for these orphan trains would be that they're taking really good care of the children, that they're being very kind to them, that their intentions are good, basically. And it gets a little murky when we actually look into it, because the way that the children are treated once they get on the train is very different from what they were advertised as. So basically, these get onto makeshift passenger trains. And they're not the trains that you would expect because the children were sitting on hard plank benches all day, which if you have ever been around a child for more than 5 minutes, you know that they do not like to sit still. But the kids weren't allowed to get up and run around. They were expected to sit all day. And then they were only given the clothes that they were changed into, basically, and they had no other clothes that they could wear. They primarily ate mustard and jelly, like not mustard and jelly, but mustard sandwiches and jelly sandwiches. That's just a weird punishment on its own. But they were given very small sandwiches. They weren't actually able to eat anything, eat a lot of other things. And then one of the important things that comes out of this that you have to remember is that these kids are coming from factory situations where all they've known is working in factories and working in things like that. And they're being taken out to the West where there is primarily farms and things like that. So you see that it's like a very culture shock kind of thing where they're being taken from what they know and put into a complete unknown. So one of the biggest problems with the orphan trades is that when they were advertised, farmers living in the West were expecting to adopt, basically, free labor. And the thing that I think doesn't get talked about a lot is that they weren't exactly looking to adopt children. Well, most of them were not looking to adopt children. They were looking to adopt farmhands because basically it was going to be a lot cheaper to adopt a child than to get someone to work for you. So a lot of the older kids went into farm work and farm labor and things like that. And then if they were younger, they became domestic servants rather than working outside. So, and this is where it gets a little complicated. When the children arrived at a station, they would be taken off of the train where they had been sitting for probably hours on end. They would be taken off of the train, put onto the platform, lined up, and the farmers and other parents were allowed to come up and physically examine them. And one of the things they were looking for the most with the boys, they would check their muscles, they would check their teeth, and they would check their strength basically just to see how strong they were, to see how well they would work on a farm. And there are a couple of instances where the children were asked to perform tricks for the parents. And basically, they were being asked to advertise themselves to these potential adopters, which is a huge problem because they're treating these children as if they're like playthings rather than actual children. And as you can see, the adoption process is fairly different from what we see today. But also, parents were not expected to sign anything, and they had to sign a legal contract, which I'll get into a little bit later. But they were never given any background checks. They were never given any home checks like we see today. So it was a lot of these children were just being taken by people in the town and then taken back. And whichever orphans weren't adopted would be put back on the train, taken to the next city, and they would keep doing this until all the orphans had been adopted. So when we start talking about these farmers adopting children to be farm labor, you actually see a lot of instances of child abuse because they were treating these kids like they were farmhands rather than children. And a lot of the children reported that they would be whipped by their parents, that they would be severely punished just because they couldn't do simple tasks, like they couldn't do tasks such as lift heavy things because they're children and they're used to working in factories or not used to working at all. So it gets really weird to where you would expect a lot of these parents to just have adopted children for the sake of having children, but that's not always the case. And the only thing that the parents had to sign was a contract that promised, and I'll read it here, but so the terms and conditions for the retention of the boy in my family being as follows. And then basically all it says is that they have to care for them in sickness and health. They have to be sent to school for an entire school year until they reach the age of 14. And then they only have to go to school in the winter months until they're 16, so kind of what we do now. And then they have to take them to church until they're 17. And then at 17, they basically don't have to say that this child is a part of their family anymore, but they do have to start paying them a wage if they're working for them until they're 18. And then when they're 18, they basically can just be cut off. So it's one of the things that I realized over the summer is that part of this taking these children away from their culture and away from their history is that they're also taking them to school and church. And something that we kind of see in advertising light-skinned kids and dressing them up in European clothing and taking them to European schools and European churches. Essentially, by taking these children out of New York and taking them away from their immigrant families and their immigrant backgrounds, they're whitewashing these kids and they're assimilating them into American society by moving them out to the West. And there are instances of home visits, and there were a lot of kids who were rehomed due to abuse, but because these orphans are living out in basically the middle of the West, they couldn't always be visited by I think they were called it was like adoption managers, I think is the name of it. They couldn't always be visited, and so a lot of kids ended up just growing up in these abusive households their entire lives because they never could be rehomed. So, and I kind of touched on this a little bit, but these were primarily immigrant children, and there were English children in there as well because there were poor English families living in New York. But it was a majority of immigrant children, and that's when we kind of see that problem with dressing them up in new clothing, kind of washing away all the dirt off of them, trying to make them look presentable and different from the way that they would have been seen in New York, which is just these immigrant children living out on the streets with the trash. And so, and talking about and looking at how the orphan trains are usually taught as this amazing movement throughout the West to get children out of New York into Western states. We often don't talk about the consequences of that and how that erasing that identity and that history goes with it. And one thing that really got to me when I was thinking about this was, if this was such a great movement, why don't we talk about it more in American history? And I think this is the reason why. Because it was erasing the immigrant identity when they were given new names, when their history was taken from them. Because a lot of these kids never knew their parents, or they were too young when they were moved, that they were never told where they came from, or if they were old enough to remember, they were given new names, they were given new birthdays, and it wouldn't be until later where they were able to return to New York and kind of get those memories back. So the orphan train movement ended in 1929, and at the time of by the time it ended, about 250,000 orphans had been rehomed, which is a lot. However, not all of them ended up in great situations. I think they said about 20% had to be rehomed in the end due to abuse or the home not working out. But we can still say this was an incredible movement. It did get a lot of children out of bad situations and put them into a new opportunity for life. But it still contributed to the erasure of their identity. So there was a movement in the 1980s and 90s for these children to go back. Well, they weren't children at this point. For the kids who had rode the orphan trains, they went back to New York. They started having reunions. and they started talking about their history together. And they started building up stories, and you can find a lot of these accounts online now. But one of the other things that was happening is that a lot of siblings who had been separated, because you could adopt siblings together, but a lot of them were separated from each other. So they started finding each other again, and they started learning, like, oh, this is my actual birthday, this was my actual name, this is where we came from. But it wouldn't be until years later when they would get this history back, and it left a lasting impression on everybody. And then I just have some additional sources in reading here. This is a statue outside of the National Orphan Train Complex Museum, and they have a movement going at the moment where if you had a relative who rode the orphan trains, you can submit a request to have a statue of them, and they're actually being remembered as the kids they became. So I think this man here ended up becoming a professor, and there's a couple of different professions that are around the area, but it's remembering the children that they, who they became when they arrived here, rather than focusing on how they got there or their life before, which is a bit of a hopeful end on that story. But there we go.